And as you probably know, it was in 1957 the Beatles met. And, or shall I say the Beatles met in the sense of John Lennon and Paul McCartney met, as a result of a church fete. And they realised that they could actually work together. Because, in fact, John actually envied Paul because he could actually remember the words and also remember the chords. And funnily enough, John Lennon wasn't so good at that. In fact, even later on in life, because he couldn't remember his own chords or words sometimes. But so he was fascinated that he could play some things that he couldn't play, and that's how they sort of got together, a mutual admiration in a sense. But of course, it started a writing partnership that became, well, one of the best in the world, isn't it? In the 20th century, those two, Lennon, McCartney, and all that. Now, eventually, from the Quarrymen, which is the original sort of band that John Lennon was in, and that was named after his school. Eventually they sort of turned into the Beatles. And even though they performed by the time they sort of finished at Liverpool 292 times in a place called the Cavern, which you may have heard of. And they thought, we really need to come down here. We really need a decent manager. And they found him in the form of Brian Epstein. And Brian Epstein, unfortunately though, had never managed anyone before, you see. Totally inexperienced. But a couple of guys came into his record store, NEMS, as it was known as, North End Music Store. That was up in Liverpool. And they asked for a Beatles record. And he said, I've never heard of it. And it's called The Sheik of Araby. And other bits and pieces. And in fact, what they were doing, they're actually backing a man called Tony Sheridan as the backing band. But the Beatles by this time were well known in the area. And so Brian Epstein was curious. He said, well, where do they play them? Just around the corner to Camden. And so he found himself, therefore, in this sort of underground room, virtually. This was sweaty, smelt of cheese and body odour. But with a lot of sort of punkish people jumping up and down, the sheer exuberance and joy and energy of it. And especially the band in front, who was sort of leaping up and down pogo-like. And so he thought, this is fantastic, the energy just coming on. Brilliant. And all the witticisms in between as well. So as a result of this, he decided to sign them up, though he didn't know quite what he was signing them up to. But he went to work, and he got them as far as outside of London, because the aim really was to go into London itself and perform. And in fact, nearby here, we're in Soho, and Soho, by the way, isn't anything to do like in New York, where it's sort of south of Houston, something like that, isn't it? But over here, it literally is a cry from when they used to hunt things. So they used to go, Soho, Soho, like that. And so that's how it gets his name. And eventually it became a pub called the Soho Pub, where the hunters used to actually have a drink. So that's where it gets his name from. Now, further down there, it's always been rather bohemian, is great Compton Street. Old Compton Street itself is the main drag through Soho itself. And that's where a lot of the coffee bars were in the 1950s. In other words, it was exciting for us youngsters, not me, and for youngsters at the time. You know, and it's also safe as well. So as a 13, 14-year-old, you'd actually come up here and go into one of the coffee bars, and you know, without your mum and dad, and eat and go home afterwards, perfectly safely. Those were the days, weren't they? And we're talking about frothy coffee being the most sort of dangerous thing you could drink at the time, and that's all it was. But down in the Two Eyes coffee bar was our burgeoning rock stars. And we're talking about people like Cliff Richard, ooh, I know, and never heard of him, and people like Billy Fury, ooh, you know what I mean? So in other words, total unknowns almost. But they were sort of mimicking the artists they admired over in the States. That's what it was at. But it was our sort of version of rock and roll. And the Beatles wanted to play there, but they couldn't. They ended up in Aldershot, which is sort of outside of London altogether. That's the nearest as they got, really. But eventually they got some gigs over in Germany. And these sort of helped them practice and hone their skills. Simply because, you see, they were playing sometimes 8 hours a day. Now, anyone who's going to sort of play for 8 hours, you're bound to get better, aren't you? No matter what you were like before. So you're bound to get better. And of course the pills helped. And that got them through the night. And so in other words, it was sort of opening their minds and eyes to a red light district, which is basically what they're in. And eventually they came back and they were changed. They sort of matured a bit, but certainly in their music. And it was then they went in search of a record contract, which finally brought them down to London itself. And at this stage, what we'll do, we'll just go across the other side of the road there. I'll tell you some more bits and pieces.